Let me introduce this talk, this conversation with a story. A story from my homeland, from Latin America. The idea is to try and point out some common patterns between the previous session and this session. I hope you noticed that in the previous session we had the Northerners, the global North, who still believe they can decide things and shape history. Here, the global South, the future. But let me tell you a story about the past. It's a story that will appear in my next book, Story of Death Foretold. Let's go back to 1969, to the Americas. Let's go back to bloody politicians drawing lines on the map with the little rulers. The bloody politician in question, I'm sure you all know him, was Henry Kissinger. In 1969, he told the then Chilean ambassador to the United Nations, Gabriel Valdés, that history had never taken place in the South, and that it would never take place in the South. You see, my old chap, said Kissinger, you see, the line of history moves from Moscow or from Beijing, passes through Europe, and then ends in Washington. That's how history goes. This view of history ignores too much. Back in 1969, it ignored what had happened in Chile since the early 1950s. And this is the story. In 1948, the United States decided that the anti-German crusade should be followed by an anti-communist crusade, and imposed this view upon the countries of the Americas. The Chilean president of the time followed suit and issued a law known, euphemistically enough, as the Law for the Defense of Democracy. We don't have to reinvent those names. They have been in use for a very long time. The Chileans, who knew better, called it, for short, the damned law. It meant that every socialist, every communist, every anti-fascist would be struck down from the electoral register, could not vote, could not take employment, and would be persecuted. So, of course, it became very difficult to campaign. In 1952, a woman named Carmen Lasso, dark skin, beautifully tan, like myself, known as La Negra Lasso, went into a town in the north of Chile. It's as hot as this. Probably hotter. Just. It never rains. It's the driest place on earth, in the Atacama Desert. The only thing you will find in the Atacama Desert is a huge hole in the soil, the copper mine of Chuquicamata. Carmen enters the town of Chuquicamata. Socialists and anti-fascists cannot campaign. It is prohibited to be a socialist. This is a question of identity. Carmen had joined the party at the age of 12. She had been born in extreme poverty. She entered the town, and knowing that she could not campaign, she always brought with her a harmonica in her pocket. Took the harmonica out and began to play and sing. And she sang more or less thus. Vamos a bailar la cumbia porque la cumbia emociona, la cumbia cienaguera que se baila suavezona. She kept dancing, she kept singing. Soon enough, a group of kids is around her. They are singing, they're dancing. Then the wives, the mothers, they come, they join in, they sing, they dance. Behind the mothers come the husbands. And soon enough, you have a political meeting. But all they do is they sing and they dance. The song they sing is about former slaves. The song they sing is about the fact that the workers in the mine of Chuquicamata feel that they are being treated as slaves. In the audience, there's a young man, very young man, an Argentinian. He's on his way to Peru, where he's going to practice a bit of medicine, which he has learned back at university in Argentina. When Carmen stops singing, in comes this younger politician named Salvador Allende. Oof. He also sings. He sings terribly. He sings tangos. And in one of these tangos, he asks the question, to whom does this mine belong to? To us? The audience answers, no. To whom it belongs? Or it belongs to the gringo. It belongs to the British businessman, John T. North, who was known as the nitrate king. King of the world, in fact. He also had operations in the Congo and in Chile. John T. North sold the mine to an American family named Guggenheim. And the Guggenheim family sold the mine to Kennecott and Anaconda. If you want to know the end of the story, you're going to have to buy the book. But I'll tell you this. The song stuck in the mind of this young medicine student. Before the decade was over, this young medicine student had become the icon of the century. His name was Ernesto Guevara. That's a good place to start. He was a boy. At the time, he was a boy. And he writes in his motorcycle diary that when he arrived in Chuquicamata, he felt as if he had passed through a sort of mirror or a hole of Chuquicamata in the soil, and from fiction into reality. Beautifully, this is exactly the device that William uses in his book, his novel, The Wall, in which the main character, a boy, passes through a hole. A hole in a wall that divides the place where he lives, where he has grown up, and separates the occupiers from the occupied. And he wakes up. How does he wake up? Into reality.
Well, yes, that description obviously is made obvious, obviously reminds people of the West Bank. And the book is set in a slightly changed version of the West Bank, but it's essentially the West Bank. And it's the story of a boy who's a settler child who believes everything his parents have told him, as all good children do, but has lived next to this wall and he's believed what he's been told about why the wall is there. But then when he's looking for a lost football, he finds a tunnel and goes through to the other side and discovers that what's on the other side of this so-called security wall is completely different from what he's been told.
This novel is a fable.
Yes, it's a fable.
Were you thinking about Alice in Wonderland? Were you thinking...
Yes, well, exactly. It occurred to me that one of the common tropes you get in children's fiction is the child who's living their everyday humdrum reality who discovers a portal to fantasy, to a fantasy world. And it occurred to me that people like settlers, religious fundamentalists, they are bringing up their children in essentially a fantasy. Their myths about why they're there and what they're doing are pretty wildly detached from reality. And I thought in writing a story about this boy, I could take this trope that's common in children's fiction and turn it upside down. So it's set in a very real setting, but the story is essentially about a child who's living in a world of fantasy who discovers a portal to reality. And when he gets through to the other side and he gets in trouble and finds his way back, he then has to deal with this, I suppose, this very interesting moral quandary of realizing that your parents are sort of deeply wrong about everything. Obviously, he wakes up slowly. He doesn't understand everything straight away. But I think this is the essence of what happens to everybody as a teenager, as a coming of age, or becoming an adult. Part of what this is defining your morality on your own, potentially against your parents. And the more extreme your parents' beliefs are, the harder that journey has to be.
How does he resolve the quandary, if he does?
Well, again, it's hard to answer that question without... well, again, I suppose referring to the conversations we've had before, I think a lot of the conversations we've had today have spiraled around themes of us and them and borders and nationhood and what borders essentially are there for. They're an artificial construct. The globe, the planet, doesn't have any borders in it. Why human beings put borders down to define who is us and who is them. And obviously in Israel-Palestine, these distinctions are starker than anywhere else, and they seem very clear because it's a racial divide. But I think the closer you look, as you become attached, as a boy who discovers he doesn't want to do evil, he doesn't want to do wrong, he begins to question, and the more he does this, the more he gets in conflict with is actually his stepfather rather than his father. And the conflict with his stepfather becomes actually physically violent, he begins to, all the ideas of us and them dissolve, and the borders kind of dissolve between who he is. And when you start to wonder who you are in that place, everything falls apart. If you don't know who your enemy is, you don't know who you are.
Could you tell us what happens to him in terms of who he was and who he becomes?
Well, he becomes lost in a sense, because I was very conscious I didn't want to have a sort of hugs across the chain link fence. If only we could all be nice to each other, everything would be okay. It's very much not that story. And as a boy, he makes attempts to make things. He goes to the other side and he gets some people kind of set upon him when they realize who he is. And then a girl helps him. And then he gets back home and he realizes he has to help the girl. But every attempt he makes to help her makes everything worse. And all of his sense of identity sort of dissolves. He loses sense of who he is. Because he discovers that to try and identify across these borders is very, very difficult. And his attempts to help because of who he is and because of his sort of naivety actually make things worse.
Is this something that had appeared in your previous novels? You have written, this is your sixth novel, if I'm correct.
Yeah, no, it's a big departure, this book. But I was, as a sort of British Jew, I've always kept sort of I've never been a Zionist, I'm completely secular, but you always kept one eye on Israel. And when the wall started being built, I became more and more interested in this wall, partly for political reasons, but also as a novelist. It seemed to me like the wall is obviously a very specific, a unique, complex and quite outrageous thing, twice as high as the Berlin Wall, twice as long, impeding the movement of Palestinians in untold ways, quite on top of all the other injustices and preventions in which they can move. But it also struck to me like a representation of a global phenomenon, actually, which is the increasing division. The story of our time, as I think, is the increasing division between the haves and the have-nots, and the increasing ease with which the haves can ignore the have-nots. And I think what the wall is, on top of the real, genuine concrete wall that's there, it's also a psychological barrier. And it's a psychological barrier that I think actually afflicts everybody in the West, and I think the Israelis are the only people who've made it concrete, which is all of us sitting here. I think our clothes have been put together by people in Bangladesh or China in appalling conditions. Our phones that we use all the time are put together by the have-nots, who live in lives of which we can't even imagine. They're so much worse than our lives. And we're using this technology all the time. We're wearing this. These people are very close to us, and yet we totally ignore them. It's very easy for us to forget them. And I think that's the function that the wall serves in Israel a lot. And again, this relates to the Alice in Wonderland thing that we were talking about, because I did 2 research trips for this novel. One was in Palestine, in which I traveled up and down many Palestinian towns. And everywhere you go, you come across this wall. 8 meters raw concrete. That's twice as high as the apex of this, as high as a 2-story building, raw concrete, watchtowers. The structures of the occupation are in your face all the time. It's absolutely shocking to see it from the West. You realise that you had no idea what freedom is until you see what it isn't. When you see people who just literally, the wall can go up from this road and you cannot go there. You used to go there, now you can't. No debate. And then a second research trip where you travel in the same territory. These places all overlap. There's not kind of east and west. The wall loops everywhere. There are tunnels. Very complex, but if you're travelling on the other side, on the Israeli roads in cars with the yellow number plates instead of the white and green number plates, you can be in the same place and you never see the wall. It's like this 2-way mirror which looks different. And when you do see it, because I was looking for it, I was researching it, they use land banks to make this wall look half the height, and they use stone cladding, literally pink stone cladding to cover it up, and it's hidden. And I was looking on the map for the best view of the wall from the Israeli side, and there's a big highway that goes very close to it outside Qalqilia, which is the town that butts out closest into Israel. And if you're so all the Israelis have to drive up and down this, and I thought they're going next to the wall. How they must see the wall from here, and it's really close, but not. There's a land bank, there's trees, and there's cladding, and I think that's this. So it's there, but it's deliberately made so that you can ignore it.
What struck me about the your use of this device, the wall, the hole, and so on, is the correspondence between the actual wall and what seems to be sort of internal wall, the line that this child has made into his very own identity, which begins to crumble, as you just told us. Were you thinking that this is exactly how things are in reality? Our walls are, in many senses, actual projections or embodiments of our internal walls, our internal separations, our internal ideas of who we are, and us and them and so on?
Yeah, I think very much so. I think everything there is polarized in terms of us and them, and I think the way the sort of Zionist narrative is sold to supporters of Israel is to always exaggerate the sense of us and them, to totally deny any meaningful attempts at peace on the other side, and to increase in Israelis and supporters of Israel a sense of paranoia and of fear and of menace. And I think... there's a certain, I think within the Jewish community, there's a tendency. There's two important organisations. One in America called the Anti-Defamation League, and the one in the UK called the Community Security Trust. And they're supposedly Jewish community organisations to monitor anti-Semitism. And I think the theory behind it is that we need to know that we need, and what Jews are often told is we need Israel because of anti-Semitism. In the 1930s, and I once found myself in an Israeli sort of fundraising thing, and it was in a synagogue, and the rabbi stood up, and in 1939 the racism was everywhere, anti-Semitism everywhere, and the next thing, before we knew it, there was a Holocaust. So if there's any racism anywhere, Israel is our safety net. This is why we need Israel. That's how you raise funds from Jewish people to support Israel. But so therefore there's a sort of investment in anti-Semitism. And I think there is the logic that used to run, we need Israel because of anti-Semitism, has begun to actually flow the other way, in the sense that the logic is we want to support Israel, so we need anti-Semitism. So there's a sense that they're exaggerating to the Jewish community, exaggerating the sense of threat, exaggerating fear, and that's within Israel and abroad. And so it's the same argument, but it's begun to flow the other way, and I think that's dangerous.
Can I ask you what has been the reception of your book among your community?
Well, I was prepared for being attacked. I finished the book, and then I carried on researching it, because I thought I researched what I needed to know for the book, and now I need to know everything, because they're going to attack me. I'm going to be viciously attacked, and I've been doing this sort of ongoing sort of MA in the history of Israel, Palestine.
But it hasn't happened yet.
And it hasn't happened yet, which is to my surprise, and it's very strange. And the book came out in America,
Why do
and
you
it
think
got
that
a positive
that's the
review
case?
in Electronic Intifada, which is the leading thing. And then the same week it got a positive review in the Forward, the Jewish Daily Forward, which I was really surprised by and slightly disappointed in a way, because I'm ready for a fight. Because I think a lot of people, but one of the reasons that I wanted to write it actually is that I feel that there are some very vocal, when people criticize Israel, there's an increasing tendency among certain people who purport to speak for the Jewish community to attack those people. So again, going back, when Carol Churchill wrote 7 Jewish Children, she was viciously attacked by, in particular, Anthony Julius and Howard Jacobson, accused her of anti-Semitism, accused of reanimating the medieval blood libel against the Jews. And when you read the text of the play, this is a completely false accusation. But it's obviously terrifying to be accused of racism. And that was one of the things that got me started on the Jew. I thought, on the book, I thought if this is how the Jewish community, or it's not actually the Jewish community, it's the Zionist lobby, which is by no means speak for all Jews, although they act as if they do. If they are making those attacks, that's when more Jewish people need to stand up and sort of try and tell the truth about what's happening.
Is that why you decided to write this book?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes.
I'm going to get into a hell of a lot of trouble here. But you decided to go into it anyway.
In a way, yes, and in a way, no, because it's not actually a radical position within the Jewish community to feel critical. I've never met a Jew who likes Netanyahu or a British Jew who supports Netanyahu or the occupation. And yet what is said within, sometimes you get from some people, yes, it's awful, yes, the occupation is terrible, but everyone criticizes Israel, so somebody needs to stand up for it, so it has to be us, the Jews. So we can discuss this here, but we can't say it in public. And I think, so again, there's a risk that you'll get in trouble for saying it in public, but I don't think it's not very radical to think it, because the occupation is indefensible, basically. If you know, have you any understanding of it, it's indefensible. And if you follow the people that defend it, they're on very, very shaky ground, and the arguments they use crumble. If you have your facts, the arguments they use crumble. Although the British media doesn't help, and the BBC does not help. The BBC's reporting of that region that was
going to be my next question. But let me, before we go into that, let's bring everybody else into the conversation. Reem, your view on this, your view on the notion that actually first one could use a form of art as a form of protest, but also the way in which protest itself may be an artistic form, and your music in many senses shows that.
Thank you, and I made some notes while William was speaking, so could I use William's points to actually to guide me through answering your question? You mentioned 1948, of course. For Palestinians, 1948 is the date of the Nakba, and what we think as Palestinians that our gringo is Israel. The difference is that the Israeli gringo didn't come from gringo land. The Israeli gringo came and started his gringo land on my land, so you can't tell them to go somewhere else. Whereas the Englishman who owned that business, if you don't like him, say, fuera, go to England. So that's one problem.
It's not that easy, but...
Yes, it's not that easy, but in our case, it's even more difficult. When you mentioned the political song, I was telling Mark that the title of my singing session, which will come later, is, Am I allowed to sing We Shall Overcome? To start with. Palestinian music is not even seen as what are you resisting? What are you? You're calling for the destruction of Israel. So as a Palestinian musician, you still cannot stand and say we shall overcome. It's a luxury. Protest music, in the way that you all know it, is a luxury for Palestinians. Because by default, if you're singing, you're saying Israel is wrong, you want to destroy it. So what people like me have resorted, and I'm certainly not the first one, many have done, is that we sing songs that say we've always been there. Punto final. And that is what is unanswerable. And I'll give you a little story. It's not going to be as sexy as your wonderful story, the way you said it.
The sexiness is Ernesto Guevara.
Well, my husband is sat there. But I'm quite interested in the Chuquicamata incident. And for me, it's quite, and I apologize that I'm so ignorant that I didn't know about it. Because for us, Guevara in Palestine is that good-looking asthmatic who's on our T-shirts. and I
you would have loved that.
and I needed... This story happened to me in Mainz, at Mainz University, and I was invited. Anytime you are invited to something that has Middle East in it, or North Africa, or Mediterranean, there is an Israeli delegation. By default. If I'm invited to an Arab conference, then I know, I won't have people telling me you shouldn't. But anytime I'm invited to something that says Mediterranean, Middle East, or North Africa, there's an Israeli delegation. So I get a phone call telling me, Dear Ms. Kelani, could you please not upset the Israeli delegation? I said, matey, the fact that I exist upsets the Zionist psyche. So don't invite me. So I go on stage and I sing, and it just so happened that that stage was on a boat on the Rhine. So they couldn't go anywhere. And the late Edward Said was with us in the audience, and I started singing some of the songs that I will share with all of you later, ladies and gentlemen. And next day I get a call. I get asked to go to the office of this wonderful man who runs the Middle East department, and he said, Ms. Kelani, you know, there was an official complaint lodged against you by the Israeli delegation. To which I said, oh, is it because I exist? He said, no, worse. Worse. I said, what can be worse? He said, because your songs, he found them so subversive that you were duping your audience and fooling them by singing wedding songs and harvest songs. You were actually telling them that you existed, and that when you are singing an 18th century song, he felt that you are telling him he shouldn't exist. To which I said, would you mind telling me who this person was? And he said he was the director of the office of Sharon. So I said, oh, this is one of the greatest compliments, because it would have been a disaster if he liked what I said. But the point is that because I am singing songs about love, embroidery, cooking, saying goodbye to your loved one, our men who used to be dragged by the Ottomans to fight in the Ottoman army, that, for me, is the true resistance of the Palestinian narrative, in short,
well
to prove we've always been there.
Well by the way, Reem, I don't know if you know this, but the last notes of music which were heard in the Moneda Palace on 11 September 1973 were "We Shall Overcome," in the version that had been sung during the Spanish Civil War. The story of the song is beautiful. Apparently, it emerges from a spiritual Negro song sang by enslaved workers in the United States. It developed into something else, and a German who was in the United States uses it to compose the song that he then will turn into No Pasarán when he goes to Spain to fight on the Republican side. It's absolutely amazing. Many years later, Joan Baez will go to Spain and will sing the song, paying homage both to the Spanish Republicans and to Allende and to the slaves. I would like to think that in those few seconds when the song was heard in La Moneda, the entire history of the 20th century was condensed. And then the bombs fell. Talking about bombs falling and dictatorships falling.
I know I look guilty, but...
Akmal, you're showing your documentary in the festival in
Edinburgh, yeah, festival.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
On the 13th of September, it's been accepted, and I'm not a political analyst. I'm not an expert politically or anything like that. I was truly inspired by the events of 2011 when I saw what happened. I was born there in Egypt, and my parents immigrated when I was 11 years old. And I just have very, very vivid memories of the brutality of that regime. And I can tell you many stories, but basically, one of the stories I remember, my dad, who worked in Italy, came back with a radio that picked up the BBC, and under Nasser, you weren't allowed to have anything that accessed media, and he had to hide it and had to really keep it a secret. And my mum was very scared that the secret police would come in and arrest him. And I just have very, very vivid memories of police abusing people and just bashing women publicly and horrible things. And so when I saw this happen, I was just mesmerized. I was completely fixated, and I couldn't believe the way it happened. Basically driven by the youth in their 20s, early 20s, using social media, Facebook and Twitter, and they did the impossible. I mean, I've got friends who worked in Egypt under Mubarak who told me they're gonna start massacring people. It's not gonna happen. There's no way this brutal system is going to be defeated by, no matter how many people get on. And the fact that they did, I was just completely overwhelmed with emotion, and I had to kind of go and speak to these people who showed extraordinary bravery. Young kids. And I think I really would like to make this point that it wasn't the poor kids who were being abused by the police, and it was like under emergency law the police can do anything to anybody, so with no accountability. And so they were raping women systematically, torturing children as young as 11 to death without any accountability or any repercussions. So to see this, the young kids taking a risk, and it was the young kids who came from middle-class families who weren't abused by the police, who didn't suffer, because the wealthy people generally didn't, bear the brunt of that brutality. And so it was even more heroic in my eyes that these young kids and a lot of them had been tortured and released after 3 months of torture, and went back to blogging again and speaking out against the injustice. So I was very, very inspired, like I've never been inspired in my life by anything.
It seems as if something changed within the youth in Egypt, just as it happens in William's novel. Something changes within. You stop fearing, and then there is no way back.
Two things happened. Yeah. Two things. The youth lost their fear. They broke that barrier of fear, which the regime worked very hard at. You know, that's what they used. That was their biggest weapon, and they did it very well. Once the youth lost their fear, add to that the advent of the internet. And the internet opened the world up to them, and they can capture atrocities on their mobile phones, for example. That was impossible before, and so a lot of police brutality was captured on mobile phones, and a lot of the torture was actually recorded by the police themselves for their own enjoyment, because that's how confident they were of not being taken into not having to answer for their crimes. And no police, very rarely a policeman would ever go to trial. And if they did, they would get lenient sentences. And this is for the most horrific abuses. And so, yeah, the social media thing really, I don't think that this revolution would have been possible without Facebook and Twitter.
Paul Mason, a British journalist, has written that there is a direct relationship between the emergence of social media, the use of social media by the youth, these global revolts, because these, the same use of social media has been witnessed in North Africa, but also in Sao Paulo just a month ago. And he ventures the hypothesis that the reason why the revolts and the protests of the 1970s did not develop into something much more powerful here in Europe, in America, and elsewhere, is because the hardware, wasn't there.
Well, I'll give you a picture of Egypt before the revolution, basically, or before the internet, rather. The state-run media is completely that. It's state-run. It is it's the mouthpiece of the regime. So everything, all the newspapers are heavily controlled. Books are very heavily controlled. And it's really mysterious why they allowed the internet to happen. There was an incident where there was a press conference interviewing the president's son, who was destined to take over. And one journalist very bravely asked him, what do you think of this Facebook thing? Are you worried about, are you threatened by that at all? And he dismissed it and made a joke about it. And he answered by saying, oh, let them play. If they want to play, let them play. Because they've had such enormous autonomy.
That was his Marie Antoinette moment.
That was his Marie Antoinette. Let them play. Let them. And they really underestimated the power of this new technology. They were all mostly old school. The old school mentality, a top-down structure. Any subversive behavior will be crushed, but it got out of hand very quickly, and it was 5 steps ahead of them, and so yeah, it's.
The thing is, you can't control. I think dictators are falling because you can't control the media in a top-down way anymore.
No.
But the messages that are coming up only get out if there's somebody listening. And I think that's where it applies. Interesting to Palestine. All the information is there if you want to find it, but nobody's listening, and it doesn't seem to be touching Israel.
No, it's interesting. I think the amount of atrocities captured on film, that would never happen before. Atrocities would continue and go on every day, and nobody would know about it. But now there's a face to the torture. There's a I don't know if you know about the story of Khaled Said.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
yes.
this young boy. Yeah, his mother.
Yes,
this was the spark of the revolution, and it really exploded after this. It was a young boy in his 20s who he was a middle-class kid, and not even an activist, not even somebody who goes online. He's not well known to the authorities, and he saw 2 policemen sharing a drug bust. And so he filmed it from a distance on his phone and then went and shared it online. And the police followed him, and they took him out for questioning, and they returned him 6 hours later, dead, and his face was complete. You couldn't even recognize his face. And so these, you know, before mobile phones and internet and social media, it would have been, the body would have been taken and no questions asked. But a lot of the kids of the neighborhood went and took photos of this. And then this one person put a website that said, "We are all Khaled Said," and it got millions of hits. And it really forced people onto the streets for the first time, young kids who weren't political, who saw this outrageous injustice. And he wasn't the first to experience such injustice. It had happened hundreds and hundreds of times before. But this was the first time you can put a face to the brutality, and it moved people in that really effective way that only an image like that can.
Peter Sachs made a wonderful point earlier on about the fact that ballads and poetry were a medium. And here we are talking about new media. Perhaps it's not as new as we think it is. In a way, what these technologies have allowed many young kids is the moment of gathering and singing together. And in a sense, that's precisely what these technologies are doing with old and new artistic forms. Giving them a certain potentiality. Do you feel, Bejan, that potentiality exists in your work with words, in your poetry, but also in your journalism?
First, I want to talk about poetry, of course. My journalism, it comes later. My poetry, talking about the protest and arts, politics or arts, I don't divide them. They are, if a poem or a poetry is a real strong poem, then it's very politic. Without using any politic terminology, without saying any words as a protest, it is itself is politic. It changes life because it gives you a way of seeing things in a different way. It makes them visible. It makes the truth visible. That's why when I think about writing poetry or writing novels, singing songs, you have to show a new way of feelings, the new way of seeing things, which is politic at the same time. I grew up in a very tiny, small village in southeast of Turkey, which is Kurdish village. I grew up in Kurdish language, and my father was farmer, and all our workers were Turkish. They were serving in our house. But when I start to go to primary school, I have to forget my own language, mother tongue. I have to learn Turkish. That was a big change in my life, big contradiction. And then I realized that all around me, which is kind of Hittite ruins are around, the Armenian story were told us, all their massacre, the sad stories. It was in our ballads, it was in our, how do you say, out?
Dirge. Your crafts and your...
Yeah. Elegy.
Elegy, right.
In our elegy. And I knew I have a different story in house, but another story in school. There was two worlds. I have to find a way to, my Turkish was better than my friends. I was translating their Kurdish words to my teacher. I was a kind of bridge. And from then, it starts, my life is like my own biography. It's like translating things to the others and show the other side of the stories. And I start to study in, I had a long journey. It started from the village until Istanbul. I studied law at the end. And I was full of images of all these archaic, tribal, different sound. And it pushed me to find a new way to get out and being told. And I was hearing a sound. For me, poetry is music, is rhythm, it's melody. If I have pen or notebooks, I can make some, metaphors. Otherwise, it's just sound. It's like it has a body. It's a kind of dance at the same time. I describe myself as a nomad. While I'm walking, I hear poetry more. When I sit, I never think of poetry. It doesn't come to me. I have to walk. I have to be on the forest or hillside or desert or anyway.
But your nomadism and your work with poetry and words has also landed you in hot waters sometimes, right? Kiran just told us that you resigned your post in
I was
the
going
newspaper.
to come there. My poetry, I didn't use any politic words, but it was so politic because I was telling something from somewhere else, which is not known by the Turkish readers, and they were curious, where does she come from? What is this poetry? It doesn't seem any poetry that they know until then. And they find it very interesting, and because through my poetry, yes, I write in Turkish, but in Turkish, there is a sense of Kurdishness, Kurdish language. All the feelings are coming from my geography, from my history. And I was telling them, yes, Kurds are not exist in Turkey. They call us mountain Turks. But I was there, and my people, my history, my past was there. I was showing them something. And after poetry, I wrote a book called, it's a prose book, journalism kind of. I wrote a book called Looking Behind the Mountain. It was about the PKK guerrillas who are fighting with Turkish army. I went to the mountain, I did some interviews with them, and then I published that. In that book, there is no politic terminology. I don't use propaganda language. I don't use any terminology which PKK used often. I just wanted to show their inner world, what they believe, what is their fate, why they are in mountain, why they are fighting, why they are, what is their real reason to be there. It was, I showed the Turkish readers, this is about existence. If you are a person, you want to be known by the others. Even God in Sufi tradition, they said God created the universe to be known. Even God needs that. We, as a simple human, primitive creatures, we need to be known by others. And when you say, I'm here, please see me, know me, and recognize my existence. This is the main essence of politics, I think. In Gezi protest, for example, in Istanbul, recently happened, probably most of you may know. This was quite, I was very, I live in Taksim area. And my house is...
This is the square where the protest
my
took place.
house is only 700 steps far from the square. I know because of iPhone. has a program, Moose. Yeah. And there we saw something very new, something very, in Turkey, Mesut would tell us more maybe. We are full of, surrounded by cliches. Even our politics is so cliche, so tight, and, for the first time in Turkey, actually, in Turkey, all the political movements are coming from above. The idea, it comes from above. For the first time in Turkey, something happened from the ground. It was very natural. It was very basic, simple. It was about this existence, what I'm saying. All those young boys and girls, they were saying, I'm here, I exist, don't touch me, respect me. I'm here and you have to respect me and don't meddle with me. That was the center of all these things happened, all this event. It was, for the first time, it became like a carnivalesque. I was saying, I feel the Rio Carnival spirit in Istanbul street. That was first and very new things for our society. And because they didn't ask for authority, they didn't take a position as an opposition. They just there, and they want to show to the authority, to the state, to the government, we are here and don't meddle with us.
Funny enough, at the same time that the Turkish youth is feeling the power of the carnivalesque becoming political, the kids in Rio de Janeiro and in Sao Paulo were saying, don't give us carnival, don't give us just World Cup and opening ceremonies of the Olympic Games, no pun intended. Give us, we are here.
Yeah.
We made a deal with you, the Workers' Party. Give us what we need, not just the spectacle.
Yeah.
Mesut, is it the case that journalists and writers can actually explain to the rest of the population, the power of this affirmation of existence, or is it becoming increasingly difficult to do so? I mean, Bejan had to resign.
No, it's not just the journalists or artists or playwrights telling people what the situation. The people themselves are feeling it and expressing it in an unprecedented way in Turkey. And as Bejan said, it's not a top-down thing. It's a huge grassroots thing, and it's coming from a group of people who are not affiliated with any political movement or any religious movement for that matter. And they are just standing up for their rights, for their individual human rights, and the government and the status quo, the establishment in Turkey was flabbergasted because they never met this kind of reaction from the people. It wasn't something that was taught to them. It wasn't something that was imposed to them. It wasn't something that some other people requested them to do. It was just spontaneous, and of course the social media helped a lot. And the people who started the protests were very middle class, very well educated people who had never gone out in the streets and protested before in their lives, and they weren't violent at all. And the reason why it got so big and spread to all the cities in Turkey was because when they started protesting in a very peaceful way, the government police reacted in an amazingly disproportionate, violent manner, and they started using water cannon, which is a terrible thing. I don't know if you've seen pictures. It just slams you down.
Colombian, I've seen enough.
It's terrible, and the tear gas. They kept using tear gas everywhere for anything you did, and at the end, as a passive aggressive reaction, the protesters started, one person started doing this and all the rest started doing it. Right in the middle of this square, a man would stand without doing anything for hours, and the police just couldn't do anything. And they came and they looked and they said, what is this guy doing? And they started looking in his bags, trying to find something. He just didn't move. He was just standing. He was called a standing man. And the next day, There were hundreds of standing men just standing there doing nothing, absolutely nothing. It was a beautiful way of protesting against this disproportionate use of violence by the police.
It's interesting that I think the identical thing happened in Egypt, and people forget that the entire revolution was leaderless. There was no leaders.
Was.
Yeah, no. I mean, yeah, it's gone to shit now, unfortunately. But it's inevitable. It was inevitable. But 2011, it was wealthy and poor, and women and men and children.
And all age groups, not just the Facebook generation.
And Muslim and Christian and disabled people. And there were no leaders. There was no defined leader that said, you have to follow me. That I think was the most inspirational part about it.
And the Egyptian humor as well, but I'll talk about it later.
The Chilean students did something very, very similar. They marched upon, in 2011, they marched upon La Moneda Palace, and they imitated Michael Jackson's Thriller. Not the general, the singer. No, they had no idea, the government had no idea how to react to that. But to begin to finish on a positive note, yes, it seems as if everything has gone, really, really, really wrongly. And yet, the same students in Chile who were out in the streets, performed Thriller back in 2011, they weren't heard, nothing happened, the demands were not met. This year, during the presidential election, the coming November presidential election, they're asking every citizen in Chile to write in the ballot box the letters AN, meaning Asamblea Nacional Constituyente, a call for a constituent assembly from the bottom. If you have enough votes with that particular call, it is not precisely legal and so on and so forth. But if that voice is numerous enough, it then produces a short circuit in the system. Perhaps we should export this device, and who knows, that may be the next phase of the global protest. As you can see, protest can be an art form, and there may be such a thing as the art of protest. Unfortunately, we have to leave it here. It's raining. We're back from the Chuquicamata desert. But I'm sure you will enjoy, after this session, a nice glass of wine. In the meantime, please join me in thanking our wonderful guests.